Today is 14 December 2006. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our interviewee today is Bob Noblitt. Bobby, we're delighted to have you here today. We usually start out by letting you say a few words about where you spent your youth, where you were educated, and how you got into the space program, just for the historical record.
Okay. I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and grew up in Middle Tennessee. I spent the World War II years living in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and I think everyone knows what happened around there during World War II. After graduating from high school, I enlisted in the Air Force and spent 4 years traveling around the Far East at the courtesy of Uncle Sam, and came back and entered college at Middle Tennessee State University. I went continuously through and graduated in 2 years and 9 months, and then I accepted a job with the Air Force at Warner Robins Air Force Base as a management intern. While working there, there was an elderly lady that was in the office, Mrs. Smith, who was the aunt of Monty Goldston, who worked at Marshall Space Flight Center. This was in 1959, before the center was originated or established. She, knowing that I was from Tennessee, she said, "Would you be interested in working in Huntsville, Alabama, and involved with Dr. Von Braun?" And I said, "Well, I certainly would." She said, "I'll send your resume to my nephew, Monty Goldston, and we'll see what happens." And in about a week, I got a call to come up for an interview, and was interviewed, and shortly thereafter offered a job. And
What year was that?
That was in June of 1960, and I came to work at Marshall July 17th, 1960. I was employee number 5209.
That was right at the beginning of the Marshall Center.
Yes, I was here when at the dedication when Mrs. Marshall and President Eisenhower came down, and I worked in the aeroballistics laboratory. Dr. Ernst Geisler was the lab director, and O.C. Jean was the deputy director.
What sort of projects did you get involved in right then?
Right away, I began working control studies for the Saturn family of launch vehicles, and trying to decide how many engines it should have, and looking at the flight mechanics aspects of the Saturn V. Eventually, I became part of the Advanced Systems Office, which was created by the co-location of employees from the Aero Lab, the Astronautics Lab, and the P&VE Lab. And we worked with Frank Williams and Herman Curler. Horst Tomei was my boss at that time, and I was at Marshall till 1967. Right before that time, I was the manager of a manned Mars flyby mission that was going to take place in 1975 using Apollo hardware.
Didn't quite happen, did it?
But there was a considerable interest in manned missions at that time, and I was encouraged by my friends at NASA headquarters to come up to NASA headquarters and work with them in planning missions to Mars. And I went to headquarters in August of 1967. And
what branch of headquarters? What
I was in the Office of Manned Spaceflight. And about a year or so after that, there was a congressman from, I believe, Minnesota named Joe Carth, who decided NASA shouldn't be thinking about going to Mars. And so the emphasis on manned Mars missions declined considerably, and at that time I began working with the Office of Manned Space Flight on space station. About after the space station studies were completed, it was kind of concluded that the space station needed a transportation system that was more economical than the expendable launch vehicles. And so when there was a series of studies on integrated re-entry and launch vehicles, and I was involved with those studies. And when the Space Station Task Force was formed in NASA headquarters, I was the second person that moved into that office to begin looking at what a space shuttle might be. And there were 5 study contracts underway, and I was the manager of all those 5 study contracts.
Who was the associate administrator for manned space flight at that time? Or
George Miller.
George Miller,
who is still active in.
Yes, a well-known man.
Dr. George Miller was the associate administrator at that time, and I was involved with all that through the process of until all the Phase A studies, until we made the selection of the Phase B and the Phase B studies, and beginning to work towards the selection of the development contractor, which was North American Aviation, eventually Rockwell. There had been continuing studies during the Space Shuttle Task Force days. I was the manager of missions and requirements, and we came up with the major parameters for the shuttle, the size of the cargo bay, the payload capability, what sort of missions it would be able to perform. And one of the more intriguing missions was 7 to 14-day manned missions, which evolved into what eventually became known as the Space Lab. When the Space Lab idea was started, Marshall was given the assignment to do a series of studies on the sortie can. And there was a contracted study that was conducted by General Dynamics at the same time, and I was the manager of that contracted study. And sort of synthesizing the output of the in-house studies and the General Dynamics study, we came up with a concept for pressurized modules and other sorts of things that would fit into the payload bay. About that same time, there was a considerable interest in Europe about participating in the post-Apollo program by the European nations. And that was before the ESA organization. There was ESRO and ERNO, one having to do with launch vehicles, the other having to do with spacecraft and satellites. And so I was part of a 6 or 8 man team that went over to Europe to brief the Europeans at their Noordwijk Center at ESTEC. I think Bob Marshall was the lead person from Marshall Space Flight Center at that time, and Lowell Zoller and a few others went along. But anyway, that evolved into an agreement with the European nations with them to develop the Space Lab. Understandably, the French weren't too keen on the name sortie can.
Yeah, I can believe that.
And so, hence the name Space Lab. There was quite a challenge coming up with, on the American side, to come up with what they thought the cost would be. And needless to say, as those kinds of things go, the eventual cost was greater than the early estimates. But I think it was a great program. Once the competition took place in Europe to decide on who the contractor was going to be, there were working groups made that involved NASA and our European partners, and Doug Lord was the head of the organization at NASA. When the sortie lab our sortie can idea had evolved. There was a guy named Jack Trott at Marshall who was I think he'd been the manager of the manufacturing lab, and he was heading the task team here, and he was planning to leave NASA and go back and be professor at Georgia Tech.
Oh.
And he encouraged me to come to Marshall to be his deputy, so that whenever he stepped back, I would be in a position to maybe move up to the manager's job. It turned out during all that process, a guy named Jack Lee showed up, and Jack became the manager of the Space Lab office at Marshall. I was then assigned to I was the program manager for the first Space Lab mission at headquarters, and one of the more challenging things we had was to come up with a process and the selection criteria and get the management instructions processed and approved that would oversee that process for the selection of payload specialists. And this was a radical new concept for NASA, particularly the manned space flight folks at Johnson Space Center, and they weren't too enthralled with the concept. But basically the concept was the investigators working group, which consisted of all of the principal investigators of the experiments, would make the selection. And of course this was part of the concept that was used to convince the science community that space shuttle and space station and space lab would be a good way to do their science.
That first mission was a very complex collection of all kinds of experiments in many different disciplines.
Well, I think there were 17 major experiments on board, and we came up with the process of selecting the payload specialists, and initially there were 17 candidates, one of whom was Ann Whitaker. And that had to be narrowed down to 2 from ESA and 2 from NASA. There were a lot of interesting things happened during that time. One is about that time NASA had a program of a converted Convair 990 that they flew along around with instruments on board as sort of an analog to what being in space might be. It turned out one of the international folks that had involved in those experiments turned out to be a member of the Communist Party. So when the aircraft would land on a U.S. government facility, he wasn't allowed to get off the plane.
Oh my!
So we, knowing that, I said we have to come up with some idea to make sure that doesn't happen for Space Lab. And so we instituted what normally takes many months process, doing the necessary background investigation on both the European candidates and the U.S. candidates to make sure we didn't. When we were nearing the time to make the announcement for the selection, and there was a joint agreement with the Director General of ESA and the NASA administrator that this would be a simultaneous announcement, and we had press releases prepared. The director of the Johnson Space Center sent a letter to the NASA administrator and said, "You'll be making a bad mistake if you let this happen." So there was
the announcement or the whole concept?
The whole concept. And there was a great consternation for a while. That's because we were within 2 weeks of making the announcement. So there was a high-level group convened and to validate the process that had been gone through. and the Europeans were asked to delay their announcement, but they chose not to and went ahead and announced their two candidates. The process was validated by NASA, and we were allowed to proceed, and the announcements were made. So that was an interesting time for all. I understand the payload specialist concept doesn't exist anymore, but as the manager of the first Space Lab mission, I had 30,000 brochures printed up on how to become a payload specialist, which were, I'm sure there's those that hadn't been destroyed, or there's a few still laying around.
I'm sure there are, and I presume we probably have one in the archive.
I think I have some decals from the first Space Lab mission and some of those brochures. But anyway, I was a manager for the first mission for 3.5 years, and then I got a larger assignment at headquarters and was the manager of all of the technology and applications payloads for Space Lab, and as a consequence, I ended up being the program manager for the first payload to fly on the shuttle, which was STS-2, which had a 5-day mission that was curtailed into 54 hours because of one of the fuel cells failed shortly after ascent, and so we spent a continuous period down at the Mission Control Center to replan the entire timeline to operate the experiments. All 7 experiments was able to gather data. However, one experiment only got 1.5 seconds of data, which was actually due to the failure to rewind the tape recorder after the testing at Kennedy Space Center. Mm-hmm. So they only got 1.5 seconds data. There was obviously a big inquiry about that. But anyway, after that, there was a great enthusiasm across the community after that. It was the success of that mission, and I was given the job of planning a grand reception at the Air and Space Museum for several hundred people, not including the thousands that really wanted to come. Mm-hmm. And Joe Engel and Dick Truly were the crew for that mission, and we had a very nice reception. Following that, there was a period of wondering what to do next, and I was involved with the Brookings Institution, where you go down to Williamsburg and read lots of books about what am I doing in the universe. And
were you still with NASA at the time?
I was still with NASA. And so I came home and told my wife, I'm thinking of a new career. And she said, you must be out of your mind. But it turned out shortly after that there was the first ever early out opportunity at NASA headquarters, and I think I was number 8 on that list.
What year was that?
That was in 1982. So I retired from NASA in 1982 and began my other adventures.
Oh, where did you go then?
Well, I was hired by Teledyne Brown Engineering, and I opened an office for them in Rockville, Maryland, working primarily with the Goddard Space Flight Center. Teledyne built some structures to go in the payload bay of the shuttle. They were the IMPES structure. They were the payload integration contractor for Marshall, I'm sure you know. And after 3.5 years of that, I was approached by a company called TRW and said, wouldn't you like to come for work for us? And they made me a nice offer, and I said yes. And so I became the senior Washington representative for TRW Space and Technology, and working with NASA headquarters, Langley, Goddard, and Glenn, at that time, Lewis Research Center. TRW was building the TDRS spacecraft. During that process, they also built the Gamma Ray Observatory. And so I was there at NASA headquarters in Washington with TRW for 5 years. I then had an opportunity to come to Huntsville as the district manager for TRW Space and Electronics, and having left Huntsville 24 years earlier, seemed like a good time to come back. And so I came back to Huntsville, and during that process, the AXAF Chandra spacecraft was built and tested and launched, and after
that was a remarkable piece of work getting that done.
Still going.
Still going great.
So I retired from TRW in October of 2000 and decided I had completed my career. And after about 2 months, I was approached, wouldn't you like to be something called a consultant? And that's what I've been doing since then.
You were also involved in the early organization of the Marshall Retirees Association. Maybe say a few words about that.
Well, I'm the past president. I served two one-year terms as the president of the Marshall Retirees Association, and it was a very enjoyable experience. We did get our website set up, and we've got some high technology operating within the association, and it's thriving and doing well. During my time in Washington, I was the president of the National Space Club in Washington and served on that board for 12 years, and had a very a pleasant time there. I also served as the Deputy Director for Membership for the AIAA for 15 years, and was the chairman of the Standing Committee on Membership for 10 years.
These interviews, of course, are partially a outgrowth of the retiree activity here in Huntsville.
Yes, we had just had a recent dinner meeting, and I'm hopeful that there will be more retirees who will become interested in that process. While here in Huntsville, through the AIAA, I also organized 2 conferences of the Joint Propulsion Committee, and I was the Joint Propulsion Conference, and there was quite a challenge to convince the AIAA national folks that Huntsville could really accommodate a conference like that, and because of we didn't have the hotel capacity and some other things that they felt that were offered at large cities that weren't offered here. But we had a conference in 2000 which they deemed was the most successful conference they'd ever had, largest attendance, most exhibits, and everybody felt good about it. That conference had not been here before but once, and it had been 10 or 12 years before that time, and it was thought there would be another 10 years or so before we were able to have that conference here in Huntsville again, but by some changes in circumstances, we were able to get the conference back here in 2003, which I think we even outdid ourselves with the 2000 conference. That was just some of the extracurricular activities.
Is there anything you'd like to put on the historical record that we haven't asked you about or that haven't come up? This is an opportunity to leave some thoughts for posterity.
Well, I considered myself very fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Von Braun's team, and was tremendously impressed with the personalities and the capabilities of all that team. It was Dr. Geisler, my lab director, was just a wonderful person, and I had the pleasure of working with a number of others. It was just really a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Any advice or thought you'd like to leave for the next generation as they come along? Listen to these old-timers talk and try to mold their careers.
You know, that's a thought provoker.
It is?
I'd say be a part of the team.
That's a very good comment. I would agree with that one strongly. It was very much a team effort.
During the early Saturn Apollo days, maybe we were somewhat naive. No doubt we were, but we didn't think there was anything we couldn't do. It just took hard work and applying yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Well, we surely thank you for coming in today for this interview. You've had a remarkable career, and it's good to have it recorded.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.